Okay, well, welcome. This is going to be a fabulous panel. My name is Mark Donnigan, and a couple things to just set up the next 55 minutes, hour or so. So we're here talking about building cloud-based streaming workflows at scale, and this is a vast subject. Should be like a week-long, 8-hour-a-day web, session. But anyway, we really are, we've done a lot of prep and hope that we can bring a lot of value to the conversation. We are going to leave a few minutes at the end for Q&A. So if in the middle there's something that you're like, hey, I'd like to know more about that, or I have a question, write it down, and we'll certainly try and get to that. And of course, the panelists will all be available after the session, and you can come up and meet them and ask further questions. But without further ado, let's get started. And why don't you just real quickly introduce yourselves, and then we're going to launch into a lively conversation. So.
All right, thank you. My name is Mayur Srinivasan. I'm the VP of Video Engineering at Fox, and we're responsible for building the cloud-based video workflows and players that support all of our large-scale live streaming events. So we were responsible for Super Bowl in 2020, which streamed to about 3.4 million peak concurrent audience. So excited to be here, and thanks for having me here. Yeah.
Rob Wilmoth, I'm a chief architect at Red Hat in the Telco Media and Entertainment Group. Our main responsibility is helping build the cloud technologies that all of the different products are starting to run on.
Hello, my name is Wolfgang Zeller. I am from Vodafone Group out of Europe. I'm based in Germany. Vodafone provides in 10 countries TV services to 22 million TV subscribers in our fixed net infrastructure.
Great. Sean Gardner with AMD. I'm responsible for strategy and market development as a part of AMD's data center group. I came in through the acquisition most recently of Xilinx. We are really focused on, as a chip company, we're focused on enabling streaming in various types. That could be things like cloud gaming. We have GPUs. Obviously, CPUs have been really the workhorse historically. And more recently, we've started to really get into acceleration. So this is everything from content creation, production, post-production, to full-out distribution.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Well, good. Thank you. So, Mayur, I'd like to start the conversation. I think it's, we're talking about building cloud-based streaming workflows at scale. So it's important to quantify what are the major components of a cloud-based streaming workflow. Yeah. And why don't you, since Fox certainly operates at scale, cloud-based streaming service, give us an overview.
Yeah, thanks you. So I'll keep it very high level. So from a live streaming perspective, the various components of a typical live workflow are, you have your signal acquisition and transmission components. So you need to think about resiliency in terms of how do you ensure that if there's a path cut, you have fallback options, right? Then from there on, you move to your encode infrastructure, potentially in the cloud, right? You want to be in a particular cloud ecosystem, you want to be multi-region, ensure resiliency there. Then your encoders are fronted by origin. That's where you essentially have your packager or your segments and manifest stored, right? And then you want to protect your origin. You want to ensure that your origin is shielded, so you have like a shield product or however you want to protect your origin. And then from there on, if you're doing SSAI, server-side ad insertion, you could have your manifest manipulation and ad stitching happen there, then followed by your delivery. And typically for scale, you'd want to have a multi-CDN strategy in place and have some sort of control plane to control which CDN an end user is put on to ensure the optimal player QA experience.
A lot of components. Yep. Wolfgang, does that look similar, or how does it diverge?
Surprisingly, it's pretty much, for us, it's pretty much the same. Yeah, with the only difference that we control, obviously, the networks. So getting content for us is easy. Distributing content for us is easy. We don't do multi-CDN because we run our own CDN infrastructure, but from a component point of view, it's pretty much the same. Small difference is we are not doing large events. Yeah? We don't have that in Europe, but we process 24/7 live TV channels, around about 3,000 across our footprint. On a day-to-day basis, that's what.
What is the mix of VOD that Vodafone is offering versus live linear?
It depends on the market, yeah. So not every market particularly has its own video on demand store. It's then third-party apps, yeah. But we have a larger market in Germany. We have video on demand, consists of on-demand content, catch-up content. It's like 50, 60,000 assets that we're prepping on a monthly basis.
On a monthly basis, yeah, interesting. Now, something else that's probably worth unpacking a little bit, Mayur, for Fox is that you're offering a direct-to-consumer service as well as you're sending to Comcast and to your partners, right? So maybe it's worth characterizing the split of what those two workflows look like.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's essentially a distribution ecosystem, right? Like you're, for the others, the Comcast and the others of the world, it's essentially an MVPD workflow wherein you're essentially potentially sending a signal for them to consume and have their own workflows for their distribution into their ecosystem, though. And for us, wherein we're reaching consumers directly, we essentially manage the infrastructure, wherein we take the signal from our upstream broadcast ecosystem, whatever the format is, get it into our transmission signal acquisition workflows, encode, and vice versa, as I described previously, though.
Interesting. Where does Red Hat fit in this?
So Red Hat spends the majority of our time, well, let's face it, we're known as the Linux guys, right? Nodding heads, that makes sense. We've been doing infrastructure technologies for the better part of 2 decades. And for us, we are taking a very serious look at how these different organizations put that technology that they're already leveraging in the cloud and make it more available at the end subscriber than it ever has been before. We're doing that with different technologies. Everybody's heard of containerization, everybody's heard of Kubernetes. A lot of it gets lumped into just a generic virtualization category. And within that virtualization category, we start kind of chunking it out to see which aspects are going to move the needle for the business, and then paying very close attention to those on the journey to the holy grail of a cloud-native architecture, or an architecture where the individual components understand how to interact with each other in a disaggregated cloud environment.
You've got to run all this software on compute.
That's true. Yeah, you definitely need, and I think it's worth sort of discussing here a little bit, because we say at scale. At scale can be vastly different things for very different types of streaming. So from our perspective, you know, if you look at something like user-generated content, it's well known that we have a close relationship with someone like Twitch. Twitch can go from 100,000 users to 100,000 streamers to 200,000 streamers from average to peak in, you know, within a 12-hour period. And so is that at scale? Well, you can then probably look at something like cloud gaming in the future. If it materializes in a meaningful way, we could be talking about millions of people, and deploying something like that where you need a latency of sub 500 milliseconds, suddenly how your cloud architecture looks like. Is it edge-based? There's obviously a big push in there, especially with the deployment of 5G. So from our perspective, we're the sort of bedrock or the foundation. So is there acceleration that's needed? It could be acceleration. I believe personally that there needs to be an optimized pipeline all the way through. And we're looking at accelerating things like various transport protocols, something like SRT potentially. WebRTC is certainly on a distribution side. And then when you start adding like watch parties and interactivity, this really starts to complicate things. So we believe that acceleration for transport, your networking side, you know, we're looking at how do we, in some scenarios, how do we make it almost like on-prem traditional production? It could be like SMPTE 2110. How do you move data around, especially with disaggregation? So it's things like this. I mean, we believe that acceleration needs to be a foundation, and are obviously working with partners like AWS and Azure and others.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, You know, I think it'd be really helpful for you each to share your experiences about, you all have been a part, and again, we'll start with Fox, but work our way down. Moving from an on-prem where you own the data center, you own the infrastructure, there's a location you can go to, and this is where all my services reside, right? Even if it's just a rack of machines, rack of CPUs. We're here to talk about the cloud. So what would you share in terms of, let's even start with just, what should someone think about when they're currently operating a sizable or an at-scale on-prem and they're going to move to the cloud? How would you counsel they should approach that?
That's interesting. It's an interesting problem to look at holistically, though, right? Like you got to step back and first understand what your audience is, what are you projecting, and how do you start designing an end-to-end workflow which is cloud-based. What are your objectives here? Resiliency, ensuring that you have failover backup options, like what happens if you go with a particular vendor, something fails, do you have vendor resiliency there? You got to think about all of this holistically, and then think about once you've designed your architecture, then start picking and piecing and like building out that dynamic.
In other words, failover looks different when you're relying on a vendor in an on-prem data center than when it's in the cloud, right?
Exactly. Like, in that scenario, you're essentially going with the black box approach, like in the on-prem. You're like reliant on your vendor. If something fails, you go to that vendor.
Or sometimes you literally have two of the same boxes in the rack, and you can switch in a split second, to. Yeah.
So with the cloud, I think the control plane becomes interesting. Like if you have that ability to design and architect and have the knobs in place to kind of switch routes or go to backup failure options if something fails, that's an important thing.
Are there some tools that either you built or that you have deployed to help in that? And what are those tools?
Absolutely. End-to-end observability is a key metric. Like at each and every component that I described in the live workflow, having good observability, and then bringing that into a common plane, a common glass plane, and also having good alerting capabilities is important, because our operational teams are not always expected to like kind of be staring at glass and reacting. You want good alerting capabilities also, so that and that's some of the things we learned. Alerting is almost probably even more important than having a lot of dashboards, though, because you can alert off and then go and look at dashboards and then react to them.
Yeah. And, so Rob, you also deal with this from kind of from the container perspective of folks that are running on, specific number of machines, and all of a sudden you want to scale up, scale down. To Sean's point about sometimes at scale is both just the sheer volume, but it also going to be needing to go from 0 to 100 in a very short period of time, whatever that looks like. So what can you share around, both what Red Hat is doing, but even a little more generically, the tools and some of the approaches and.
Yeah, so I think it's one of those that we could literally spend 8 hours of your week-long how to do this conference on. But I mean, the simplest components that you have to keep in mind are, and this is going to sound really strange coming from the super technical Red Hat guy, the people. Mayur alluded to it a minute ago, the culture of your organization and the individuals that have to end up working together that didn't used to work together as you transition to a fully software-defined cloud-native architecture can be challenging. Getting those teams thinking about the governance, thinking about the policy, thinking about the security controls of your data and of your utilities and of your applications, potentially not living where they used to, or even not even giving the business owner control of where that thing actually resides, that's terrifying. And so getting over that hump initially is a really big deal. Then aligning the people with the process of understanding how this thing's actually gonna work. So as you build out the architecture, it's not just a technology architecture, it's a process architecture. How does it map back to the business need? How does it make sense to the business? Okay, now comes the technology, because technology is cool, but unless it's solving an actual business need, there's not really much point. So when you get to the fundamental technology pieces, then the real work begins and you start actually pinning things together, creating these service chains that may or may not be in the same state of ready to be disaggregated as the rest of it. So You may even have some greenfield stuff that's brand new, that's fully cloud native right from the get-go. And then as you take a step back, you're like, well, that thing, that's nowhere near ready to be cloud native. That's nowhere near ready for the cloud. How do I connect the two in a secure fashion? Am I going to use public pipes, or am I going to use some type of privatized hyper-secure pipe that still has to meet all of the requirements? So Red Hat's been helping with a lot of the telecommunications companies, which is why there's Telco in my title, and understanding those lessons learned and trying to build the platforms that support these different architectures and applying those lessons learned to newer technologies such as the media and entertainment industry.
Okay, so I think I need to tie into that. When we had the discussion, we're going to move our on-demand workflow into the cloud. We had a heated debate with operations. Where is my content? What's going to happen? So, guys, you know where the cloud is? It's like on the other side of the road. There's the data center.
There's the data
it's
center.
actually close by. Yeah? So don't worry. Yeah? That's one aspect. But the other one is we actually did a lift and shift. Yeah? So we made it first software first on premises, and then we moved slowly component after component into the cloud, making sure for operations people nothing changes so much. Yeah? A key learning was obviously we love to build data centers. Yeah? Data centers we know how to do, what they cost us, how we run them, how we maintain them, when we have our service cycles, when we need to upgrade and so forth. Moving to the cloud, all of this does not exist. Yeah? So we had to learn a new discipline, which is like managing cloud costs. Yeah? Which is a completely new discipline. It requires different mindset, different people. Yeah? All of a sudden you have forecasting discussions. Do I go to this provider, that provider, use this encoding engine because it uses so much CPU? Do I use a different one? Yeah? And then, as I said, we have a lot of catch-up content that we need to push through the system. It's always a big wave of demand. Yeah? So obviously you scale when you need to, and then you scale down. But it's all pretty new to learn. Yeah? So we had to put a lot of actually finance tools in place, yeah, which sounds very weird for a video operation. Oh, I need to look now after a single cent what I do here. Yeah? But that's what people learn. And actually, we got it into a gaming mode. Yeah? So we say, hey, we have a big wave of content coming, so let's see where we can actually optimize and save money from. Yeah? So it's a game changer. Yeah?
And how much of your workflow is in the cloud?
We moved,
right now?
I think 80% of our on-demand content into the cloud. Yeah?
Wow.
Live, we haven't yet. Yeah? Because it's more complicated, because we're in 10 countries and we have like 12 headends more or less, yeah? So which is quite an exercise. Yeah?
Got it.
And moving to the cloud sounds fantastic, but if you don't have the right network connectivity to the source of your content, it gets complicated. Yeah?
And when you say you moved 80% of your VOD, now that means the components, so from the encoding, packaging, all the media processing framework.
The whole shebang, yes.
Server-side ad insertion, the manifest manipulation, all that stuff.
All of that,
right?
all of that.
Wow.
Here's the interesting question. Which part didn't you move and why?
Oh, what we could not move is we have a lot of legacy cable devices. Yeah? So here comes the awkward story. Whatever we do on the cloud, we had them to feed back in the local infrastructure in our local data center to make sure we can keep the same services for our legacy customers. Yeah?
Right. Yeah,
But other than that, we pretty much moved everything. Yeah?
Interesting.
And I have to say, on-demand is not so mission critical, so you have still some time. You can fix stuff. Yeah? For live, it's a completely different game.
Live is live.
And I think that is a good sort of delineation point to some degree. Not to say that you can't do live, but I think it's at what scale, what's your volume of on the ingress side and egress. For a single live event, sure, but if you're running a large streaming service where you have user-generated content, trying to do that. It can be done, but it's certainly latency becomes a much tougher aspect. And then the question, what we've seen with customers and recently, is it actually became more costly because of egress. And the other thing that we found was, depending on the size of the organization, where are their consumers? In some areas, they've got internet connectivity is much more expensive, and so they want to kind of move things around and maybe have a different infrastructure for a different particular market, because maybe their business model may be different and be able to withstand certain expectations or quality of service in certain regions.
Makes sense. Mayur, for Fox, how much of your workflows in the cloud?
Yeah, we're heavily cloud dependent, right? Like we are pretty much our entire video workflows are cloud-based. We do have some physical encoders that we use as potentially as backups or things like that, but we're heavily cloud-driven, microservices architecture-driven, and stuff like that. There's an interesting point about scale that I heard from Wolf, though, right? Like one thing to consider, like when you think of cloud-based workflows, you assume that it's infinitely scalable. You can just scale to whatever audience peaks you get, but as part of like running large-scale live events, an important thing to consider as part of your prep work for live events is what's your audience projection? Like how do you anticipate what your audience is going to be for a particular event, and then do the necessary operational steps to pre-warm, pre-scale your infrastructure up.
And that's the financial management side, I'm guessing, Wolfgang, that you're talking about, because now you actually have to plan how much capacity are we going to reserve, or are we going to spin up, and is that enough?
Yes, you have to really plan it in advance. Yeah,
and so I think this is an interesting jumping off point. We don't need to spend too much time here, but I'm assuming that everybody in the audience is, either building or operating or working with similar scale. So we all have to think about costs. So I'm sure that they would love to get some insights into what does that process look like? Can you unpack a little bit what the planning process is? Who's involved in it? How are decisions being made?
A little bit, yeah. So we have, of course, a media planning team that knows exactly what type of TV broadcasts we have, yeah. It's now very specific. We need to exchange the advertisements before we put them on catch-up, yeah, because we need to insert after, so there's a little bit of prep done. So we get a decent forecast what the volume is going to be, yeah. And then we have to differentiate it between high-priority content that needs to go in as fast as possible, and then you have content which can take a little bit of a while, and then you have content which actually nobody watches, but you still need to have it on the platform.
A long tail.
The long tail that comes last, yeah? And those are the three drivers. And depending on this one, you put in your premium content, if you like, or the priority content on a premium encoder with high priority and a lot compute, and you spend a lot more dollars per encoding minute, if you like, yeah? And then you can go to the long tail content, which you then probably shift around on spot instances just to optimize and get away fairly cheap. And that's how this is done, yeah? And we have created a software in-house when we talk about tooling, and that manages this process. Yeah?
Interesting. Now, I heard you say something that was fascinating. So do you actually have a different encoding workflow that you send your tentpole movies, the premium content through, compared to?
Yes, so we pushed it a little bit further. We have like some sort of bidding in place. Yeah? So we have different encoding partners. We know what they charge by the minute on that day. And depending on the content priority, it's going to be shifted around. Yeah? It took us a while to get there. We had a lot of hiccups, yeah, but now I think we're in a quite stable place. Yeah?
Interesting. Yeah. Does that sound similar?
It's very similar. We have the concept of like high availability workflows, wherein for like our premium events, we scale, have everything pre-warmed and ready. Yeah. It's an expensive affair to do, though, right? Like,
but if it's a Super Bowl, it's worth it.
Pretty much. Have everything there ready, though. But for our regular day-to-day operations, we kind of run our infrastructure in a different mode, ensuring that we, depending on the target audience and stuff like that, we have the necessary components in place. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. That's helpful. So Rob, everything's just awesome with containers, right? Docker just solves everything. I mean, that's how I can run my software, and just move it anywhere.
Let's go with
pretty
that.
simple, right?
That sounds cool. Yeah.
Okay,
that's the way it works, at least.
So tell us why we're laughing
TV.
up here. And
so
this isn't true.
Yeah. So it's one of those situations where you have to look through your environment, look through your architecture, and in the case we've now heard a couple of times, just because you can do something doesn't always necessarily mean you should. So you have to be very strategic with how you create your container adoption journey, and it really is a journey, because think about it. We just now finished doing virtualization. Okay, let's face it. Nobody actually completely finished doing virtualization. There was still that random physical piece of hardware sitting in a closet that was running something incredibly important that couldn't be virtualized for insert reason here. Well, now we're throwing containerization in the mix. So how do we mesh that in with everything? And it kind of goes back to that entire planning process. So if you take a step back and say, I'm going to plan this thing out, it's going to be incredibly complex to plan, it's going to be difficult, it's going to be challenging on a culture, the whole people process technology standpoint. But then what comes out the other end is something that is incredibly simple. You're running not complete applications at scale, you're running the individual components of the applications at scale. So if you only need one little bitty chunk to scale up because the database doesn't need to scale up with it, it just does it, and then once the job is completed, it rolls back in and releases that resource to go do something else, which is how you start getting the economies of scale. Where it gets more complex again is when you start adding more and more chunks. So if you think about the entire service chain of what you're building, and you identify the components that you're going to move depending on where you are within that journey or where that ecosystem partner is within that journey, that's what ends up really moving that needle and helping you move much quicker to get to that, like I've said earlier, that holy grail of cloud-native distributed architecture. And we're seeing other industries take that approach. We're seeing other industries struggle with that approach. And really the guiding principle is to take a look at the ecosystem of partners and in-house technologies that you're leveraging, figure out which ones are ripe for the picking, which ones are not necessarily even the lowest hanging fruit. Because if you do something that's too simple and nobody cares, then maybe that wasn't the proof point you wanted to start with. You want something that's easy enough that you can accomplish it, but means enough that people notice that it actually makes the financial impact to, or the business impact to go ahead and continue doing the next one.
Any experiences to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things. What we've seen in working with cloud partners, some of them move them at different rates. Some of them, if you have a specific technology or something you're looking for, you have to make sure that that cloud partner has that. They can sometimes take a while to update things. They typically, once they get an instance or something up and running, it's usually available. If you can run it in traditional software, it's always generally better to do that. But if you need some acceleration because of the economics, like I was saying before, that when you're running something with user-generated content or cloud gaming or some of these other sort of newer services that are coming out, you probably need some level of video or pixel level acceleration. The cloud vendors all have different kind of strategies. And if we kind of back up and think about their business model is, I want as much of the business as I can get, and how do I differentiate versus my competitors? So naturally, their goal is to try and get you in there and win your business. So I think that's one of the other things that we're seeing is that they all kind of have their own roadmaps and their own strategies around media and the role they want to play. So I think it's critical for you to establish relationships with them and get an understanding of what their strategy is.
So it might be interesting, Sean. I know, and there's public disclosure, so share what you can from a stage in a public setting. Sure. But what does that look like specifically for video encoding? Maybe some in the audience are not aware exactly of Xilinx, where Xilinx fits in, how that, certainly everyone knows AMD, but probably thinking of EPYC and the CPUs. So when you talk acceleration, what does that look like in the workflow, and what are you referencing? Because there's specific products and solutions that
it's interesting. If we use Twitch and kind of the scenario we're talking about here, I mean, Twitch has, very high popular content. They kind of have some medium that could be shifting up, and they have a
long tail.
They have an extremely long tail. And so they treat all of theirs very similar, that they have CPUs, they're using, like AV1. Those are, for some of that content, any one stream will consume massive amounts of bandwidth. They'll want to use the absolute best encoder and the latest encoder, and that generally is software. And so that's what they'll deploy. For other content, maybe they have different regions, because certainly in the US, it's very Apple focused. They have a huge footprint. And that's the other thing that we haven't really talked about is where are your consumers and how do they consume? On what devices? Is it traditional sort of at home, or is it a mobile first market? And different parts of the world, oh, this is only Android. Okay, well, in that scenario, it can't be HEVC, it's gotta be VP9, and that was with Twitch, we implemented a VP9 accelerated solution for their content. So I think that's kind of the other thing that we haven't really talked about is, what does your consumer look like, and what is the story there? So from our perspective, with customers like Twitch and others we've had, they generally will look at, if I have a long tail of content, I want to keep the absolute lowest cost per channel. And the other thing that I think is different also is media is somewhat like any other data. Most of these clouds were set up with kind of a TCP, it's a kind of small workload based, you do something, you light something up, you do it, you shut it down, and you'll do that many times. With video, it's a flow, and it can be on 24/7. So it's kind of a different architecture, but from a hardware perspective, or a semiconductor, let's call it, we believe that moving forward, there will continue to be a strong need for software, and that, especially if latency isn't critical, it's much easier to move that around. But as soon as you have a latency critical application, most likely now you're going to start to push out to the edge. If it's high volume, then you're going to most likely need some kind of acceleration hardware, encoder and transcoding acceleration.
Yeah.
AV1 is one of the big ones that we've been working on and have both, software with Visionware, a partner of ours, which you can see at our booth, but there's lots of solutions that are coming out.
All right. It's interesting what you mentioned there about computer edge and stuff, though. So one of the real life practical issues we faced as we delivered like large scale events as Super Bowl is like use cases around token validation, right? Like you have end users trying to play secure streams, and you want to be like validating, are we streaming securely, and you're doing some token validation. We've run into challenges wherein some of the public microservices stuff that you expect to validate tokens struggle with the scale that we're dealing with.
Well, within 30 seconds, you have 500,000 people trying to authenticate, right? Because everybody's starting at the same time.
One mashing and like starting at the same time.
Yeah, it's the thundering herd problem, right?
Yeah.
Right. So you got to be careful with that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's been well documented, and I'm sure we all have scars to prove that. A lot of times when a video service doesn't play, it nothing to do with the video pipeline. It was authentication. Right. It was just so. Wolfgang, I'd be really curious to know how Vodafone, how you think about scale. And I'm going to leave the question sufficiently, broad and general, because I'm just curious to hear your thoughts, even personally, and I know the audience would too. But, within Vodafone, how did you approach even thinking about, hey, where do we need to really, again, in kind of air quotes, really be proactive and thinking about, okay, we need this capacity now, but, and I don't know, whatever the period of time is, some period of time, some longer, and then, and how to build that. Like what parts of the workflow and what parts of just your system, your platform, all of it, presumably on some level, but there must be somewhere that you really...
Yeah, so it's like two things. Yeah, if you talk about just the platform which drives the user experience, we have like this normal curve of people coming home, watching TV, going to bed, waking up in the morning, like everybody else. Yeah? You can have now two choices. I can have capacity pre-provisioned all the time, which is a bit of waste of money. Yeah? Or you just go along and then you try to figure out when people are watching. Now, it's not so as bad in the US, but we have also different time zones in Europe. Yeah? So this window is just getting a little bit bigger. And then you have cultural differences, which are really amazing. Yeah? So a German TV consumer behaves timing-wise completely different like an Italian one. Yeah? And if you factor this all in, then you say, okay, I have to run this actually 70% of the time at full capacity. Yeah? And then you try, okay, so should I break it down now regional or not? Yeah, and you play around and then you have some incidents, then senior management, what are you guys doing? Are we optimizing the money? No, just keep the capacity up and running. And we got very clever. It is a SaaS model that we have with our external partners, and together with them, we really invested quite some time to profile the average, let's say, German, Italian TV subscriber, yeah, to see how we can actually optimize our scaling, yeah, for this.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then we have another thing. We have tons of set-top boxes, yeah, and they some of them legacy, some of them new, and they have a very uncommon behavior, which is called maintenance mode. So they wake up during the night, they fetch the new recordings, they do updates, and so on and so forth, and all of a sudden, your complete TV population wakes up in a 4-hour window. Eh? And you need to pre-provision capacity to dish out EPGs and other updates, software updates, and so on and so forth. It's yet another component where you can play around with scaling. Yeah? And unfortunately, set-top boxes really work most of the time against you and your ambition to be as cost efficient as possible, yeah? Because there's always a bug or something not completely implemented, yeah? That just spike your API calls like crazy, and the next morning, and we really do this, the next morning you get a consumption report and a financial report to see on your spending and say, okay, that's not good for my KPIs. Yeah? So we need to go back, go to the software engineers. Wow. So that's how we are toying around. Yeah? And the other one, the easier one we talked about is the video on demand workflow. Yeah? It's interesting for content people because it actually gives them a good impression what actually content acquisition cost means. Yeah? And how much money they need to invest to get it to the customer. Yeah? But it's compared to the platform scaling, quite easy, yeah, I have to say.
So you said something that, at least I know the vendors in the room, probably their ears perked up. So you made the comment that most of your vendors you're working with have gone to a SaaS model or a consumption-based pricing model, which is very interesting because again, when you're buying black boxes, you pay X for the box, and hey, you use it, you don't, but the vendor got paid, right?
Correct.
Was that easy for you to bring vendors along to that, or were they already there with you? Or
some of them were already there. They had this initial business model, which was easier to convince. And then we had a classic one, our security provider was not really a cloud provider. So we invested 2 years of joint efforts to get to the place. And they are now in a very good spot. Yeah? For them, it was a good strategic investment to get there.
Yeah, yeah.
One of the things we haven't talked about that maybe I'm interested in hearing, what my fellow panelists have to say, but we're seeing lots of, unbeknownst to us, like from a video pipeline, is security is becoming a big discussion. Mm-hmm. And for us, it's video. Traditionally, you think about an SDI flow or whatever, what could possibly go wrong? But especially in the cloud and with some of the geopolitical things going on, there's a real interest in security, and it's coming down to us at a silicon level. So I'd be interested in hearing what their thoughts on security and how that's affecting.
Yeah, security and scale are interesting concepts which go together, right? Yeah. So for delivering like super large scale events like Super Bowl and stuff, we need to have a balance there. You can't potentially go with, like for us, the review we took at Fox is like, what's the minimal amount of security we need to have on the streams so that we don't end up like DDoSing ourselves, right? Like, and have that ability to ensure we're delivering streams to end users in a good way, though, right? So typical things like encrypting your segments, tokenizing your URLs, just making sure you're securing your streams, and like having short tokens on your core URLs, things like that gave us the ability to deliver streams in a secure way. Now, the short answer there is, you can go a bit further and look at explore DRM and getting that into your ecosystem, but then you start dealing with scale and logistics around license server, like how do you scale that up, how do you manage it in your infrastructure and stuff. So yeah, lots of interesting challenges there. It's all doable, but how much do you invest in this, and what are your business needs? It all comes down to business and rights, the rights.
Exactly. And there's a risk profile to all of it, right? And different organizations and different content, different business models, it's different. So it's hard to, security certainly for
absolutely.
Red Hat is,
it's one of the key pillars that we have to operate in. We've been, again, I come back to the experience that we have of doing the underlying platform, being the conduit in which everything flows to get from the applications that are providing the business function to the hardware and ultimately out of whatever system you're working on, gives us a unique vantage point to do things like vulnerability scanning and do the general operations things that we've talked about. But it also gives us a unique inflection point to talk about how the actual network performance works in correlation with the security technologies that are actually happening. We've worked with several of the security vendors to make sure that when they are working on certain projects or certain aspects of not just media, but also telco and financial services and things like that, where we can draw some other lessons learned, especially within government agencies, and say, okay, you know that when you put this constraint on this particular type of resource, it has this type of negative inflection. Can you lighten that up a little bit and still do the job that you need to do? Or is there something we can do on the hardware level that makes it such that that act is maybe accelerated is the wrong word there, but it's taken care of at a different place that makes it such that the software is completely just unaware of what's going on unless something goes wrong, and then we capture the report, throw up the red flag and say, fix this or do something about it.
Yeah, interesting. So case studies are always awesome, you know, because you can hear from someone else either what to do or what not to do. Let's start with what to do. Does anybody have an example of an on-prem shift to the cloud of some service that went well? And if you can share just a little bit of nuggets, you know, of like, why did it end up going well? What were the success factors? And then the follow-on question after that will then be one that didn't go well and what was the learnings, but let's start with the positives. So
Yeah, I probably can do. So when we moved our on-demand workflow basically across the street to the cloud.
Yeah, that's right. Well, where's the cloud, Wolfgang?
Yes.
Across the street.
It's across the street, so that's my default answer, and most of the time I'm pretty right about that. So what we did was like keep it simple. Don't overdo it. Start with the basics first and do step by step. Yeah? So our CTO has like this crawl, walk, run. And if it's about anything, please stick to that. Obviously, the vendors will tell you we can do sophisticated stuff, this, that, and the other. Yes, of course, yeah. But not right away. Yeah?
And so what did that look like? Did you, for example, carve out, I don't know, I'm just going to pick on the encoding services and say, hey, we can easily, you know, we're deploying on servers, you know, in our data center here in the next room. Just move those across the street.
So the pitching story was, we have now a rack full of our encoders, you know them, and we have now one you don't see, but it behaves just like the same, it's across the street. Yeah?
Exactly.
So that's how we did it, yeah? And then we moved all the racks, they were all gone, and then we do packaging and then other pieces, yeah?
Awesome.
One after the other.
Yeah, okay.
And it takes more time, yes, but you give people enough time to get accustomed to the process and experience by themselves, that's not a bad thing, yeah?
And I liked what one of you said in the very beginning, that, you know, there's the people readiness, which is almost more important than choosing the right technologies and the right vendor partners and all of that.
It's interesting. I mean, we've spent inordinate amounts of time, like even into our workflows, like building up like documentation, training material for our reliability operations teams to first understand the technology they're supporting and then have the necessary guidance to react to like end user events, right?
Yeah,
so it's an important aspect of Telco.
It's interesting because if you look at like AWS, I don't know how many instances or types they have now, but it's hundreds. And you can go and get certified to be an AWS advisor because there is a complication. So there is a huge learning curve when you're going to move. You know, when you control something, you understand it. It's a different skill set, or people really do need to relearn or learn a new approach and new offerings from their vendors.
Okay, so what are some learnings from maybe something that didn't go well? Anybody? I mean, I know everything went perfect at
No, I did
Fox,
not, no.
Vodafone,
No, it did
and everything Red Hat does, you know, never, you know.
In the beginning, it did not. I think where we completely failed short was capacity planning.
Capacity planning.
Capacity
and we've
planning.
talked a lot, really. We've given a lot of airtime on this panel talking really about capacity.
It is really, it was capacity planning. So the first trials were disastrous.
So let's unpack that a bit. So, you know, was it just maybe not understanding all the data, or even having access to all the data, or assumptions were incorrect?
People are used on premises. You know everything. Everything is there.
Yeah.
The cloud, it's not. Yeah? And if you don't ask for it, you're not getting it. Yeah? And if you don't have resources provisioned properly, then all of a sudden everything starts to get slower, fall down, and you get pretty much nothing at the end of the day. Yeah? And people are like, okay, I put now this 10 gig file, yeah? It's gone. What do you mean it's gone? Literally gone. Yeah? Thank God it was a test file. Yeah?
Yeah.
An interesting thing we found was even features also, right? Like the features supported, say, on an on-prem solution, an on-prem encoder. If you move to the cloud, are the same feature sets supported? I mean,
You assume,
you
right?
assume,
Maybe,
right? Like,
especially if it's same vendor.
Exactly, and then when you actually get into the details and start working out your settings and everything else, you find some nuances which are absent, and that's when you end up struggling. So these are some things.
Yeah,
To answer
interesting.
your question, not gone well.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, this has been awesome. We have, I guess, a little less than 10 minutes left. If there's questions, I think it's perfect time to transition to Q&A. So, all right, we've got one in the back there. Antonio's gonna, oh, he's running. We got a mic coming to you, sir.
It's a quiet group. I think you can probably hear him.
Hi, I'm Darian. I'm from DigitalOcean. So I was curious, you know, we're talking about cloud obviously here, but there wasn't a distinction drawn at any point between sort of bare metal and cloud, which is a potential other option for not necessarily high scale workloads, but workloads that you don't necessarily want to run on-prem anymore. Is there a distinction that anyone draws between, or do you guys make use of bare metal heavily in any way? Does that form a subset of your infrastructure, or is everything in a hyperscaler?
I had a question on here we didn't get to. It was pretty much that one. so thank you.
So for us at Vodafone, it's quite easy. So everything we do live is really bare metal.
Yeah.
It's like still old school, kind of works, runs 24/7, large broadcast operation. We keep it for now. Yeah? Everything we do, as said, on-demand processing, we're going to push completely to the cloud.
Okay. Yeah, for us at Fox, it's been very heavily cloud-based, so bare metal is not so much of a consideration in the cloud for us, but I mean, as we look at other use cases potentially down the line in the future.
What about with the telcos you guys are working with?
Yeah, so a lot of the stuff that they're doing is bare metal based. We're finding that more and more, based on the feature parity that we're finding in the public clouds, can be transitioned. But when we first started, the first time we tried to transition a 5G core, it wasn't there. It needed some work. So we did have to kind of build on that parity, or build on those features to kind of connect that gap. And what I would say is, as advice to anybody looking at doing this, is from the feature standpoint, if you build to the standard that is open and in the upstream that the communities already have on their trajectory and don't change from that too much, you're going to have a better path to success, even if you're actively contributing to those communities to get the features that you want. It's when you end up on one of those diverging paths that a lot of the traditional fixed wireless carriers found themselves in a lot of trouble.
I'll just add to that. What we're seeing is, I think it depends on where maybe you're located. So if you have if all your business is very centralized in one area, you can make different choices. So I think it depends on, where's the location, is it live, latency, how critical is that? I think there's various things that could determine who maybe the right cloud vendor is. So we also see, depending on the size of your business, that can also affect.
Awesome, good question.
Okay, test. Yeah, there we go. So, hi, Darian from DigitalOcean again. Curious, you talked about, Mayur, you talked about the need to have different regions
Right.
for failover. But do you feel the need to have a presence on multiple clouds? Does that help you optimize costs or reduce risks?
Yeah, that's an interesting question there. We've actually mulled about it quite a bit, and we were even, before we came into this panel, we were having an initial chat on what parts of our workflow do we need to think about it in terms of, does the entire workflow need to be cloud agnostic, or are there even parts of the workflow which can be potentially made cloud agnostic, right? Like, so we initially started off on the strategy of like, maybe our control plane can be cloud agnostic, and we can use some of the containerization techniques there to make our services cloud agnostic. But then fell back and decided, okay, we're gonna stick to a particular cloud. Let's for driving down costs, everything else, let's get that resiliency within that cloud first, and then potentially down the line in a later phase, look to optimize and be cloud agnostic. So it all depends on what the business needs, and like, do you have the money to spend on that, and like, what sort of complexity do you want to build into your ecosystem, right? It's because going to a multi-cloud solution is a complex affair, and like, and then like operationally, you got to think from an operational perspective also. Like, now you're introducing another cloud. How do you build the tools necessary for your operational tools to react to them? And yeah.
Is Vodafone on, do you have a multi-cloud strategy?
I am a big fan of multi-cloud, yes, for various reasons. Yeah, so resiliency, yeah. We are super paranoid about that. Coming from a telco background, pricing, yes, but it comes with a huge price tag in terms of complexity. Yeah? So it's not across one street, it's across another street. Yeah? So that requires a lot of explaining and a lot of synchronizing across. Yeah? So we are not there yet, yeah, but I think it's going to be, when we have matured in one and you have everything under control, you have done the abstraction work, yeah, then you can take the next step.
Yeah, I'm hearing a very consistent crawl, walk, run theme through all of this. It's don't boil the ocean, you know. So we have time for a couple more questions.
I think you should just come up here. Grab a chair, Will.
I'll keep the mic. So, hi, Darian from DigitalOcean again. Curious, so you guys obviously have a better sense of prices for various things in the market. I'm curious because we talk about storage versus bandwidth versus compute, things like that. Do you think that there's one area that's I guess overpriced right now and that is primed to be competed down, or do you think everything is more or less in the same level? I guess I hope makes sense as a question.
That's a good one.
That's a good one. Yeah, that's interesting. Again, there are areas within the workflow which we're seeing trends which are pretty similar. I think certainly on the delivery front, I think we're seeing a lot of similar pricing in terms of.
I think Dan said yesterday about 10%, right, between everybody. Pricing is, yeah.
Then if you look at other parts of the ecosystem, like say server-side added insertion components and stuff, depending on the complexity of your business use cases, we've seen a lot of variation there. And then as you account for scale as a factor, are you running this SSAI components in your vendor's infrastructure, or as Fox, I mean, we get good pricing with our cloud vendors, right? Like, so do we have the ability to run those services in our cloud infrastructure? And these are all factors which add to variance there, though.
Yeah.
If you look at even public pricing, if you have a contracted amount versus spot pricing, I mean, there could be a huge drastic difference. That's provisioning, right. And I forget who said it, you know, forecasting or provisioning, right? It becomes critical.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, we probably could squeeze one more question in. All right. Maybe we can get two.
Is it on?
Are you from DigitalOcean?
I wish. I'm actually from Portal Hologram. It's a company that does teleporting, and we deal with how to build our own resilience as far as multi-path connectivity to the receiving end. So one approach is to leave it to the cloud provider, that they never fail. But our experience is that we need to build multi-path ourselves, so if one fails, we switch over to the other one so the client almost doesn't see the glitch. So is that part of any strategy on your end to think of, or I'm just curious?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, not that particular use case, but I mean, failover scenarios are very common in our ecosystem. In fact, we, as part of our high redundancy workflows, we ensure that we've have failover components for each and every part of our workflow. If one component fails, is there a backup there? And you could have different, think of it as circuit diagram, something breaks, is there a path to end, right? So we spend a lot of time kind of orchestrating these failover scenarios and even doing things like chaos testing and stuff like that to ensure that your high availability workflows are working as expected.
I'm not referring to a particular component. For example, we have a graph where communication can go from Los Angeles to Tokyo, going through a node in Mumbai, India.
Right.
And that path suddenly misbehaves, so we have to figure out quickly trend, graph path.
Right. Yeah, on that kind of boils down to the delivery side of things. If we, in our observability tools, are seeing certain issues with some of the stuff that you mentioned, like ASNs misbehaving and stuff like that, we have the knobs in place to kind of say, let's turn off that path and reroute users to a different path, right? So.
And the other question I have is, why not delegate all the encoding to GPU, since AWS provides instances that are GPU capable? So is there a trend to move away from CPU-based encoding and just do everything in GPU?
Yes, I mean, I think that's a common trend. I think taking the AWS example, yes, that's absolutely right. Depending on your resolution and what you're looking for, using GPU-based stuff.
I spent a ton of time in this. There's a big, you can look at it quality or bit rate, because you could always trade video quality for bandwidth or bit rate consumption, right? If you look at a hardware encoder versus a software encoder, you always can get the latest and greatest. You want to use VVC, there is no VVC hardware encoding out there today. Yeah. You want to use AV1, there's limited, but you have a lot more options with software. Where we believe hardware-based encoding or transcoding, GPU or other, because there are other instances available, it's where you have a large volume of traffic. That's where you're going to get the best return on investment. If you have one pristine, it's the NFL and it's the Super Bowl, you want to get the absolute best compression efficiency you can get within depending on your latency. This is the other sort of element you have to look at, is what's the latency, because software getting great compression efficiency tends to work slower. So these are the kind of things you need to look at.
Actually, the benefit I see to GPU-based encoding is speed up in faster than real time. So NVIDIA has this NVInc technology.
Yep.
Encoding there is 10 times faster.
Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely. There's a lot of different approaches for encoding. We're at time. Thank you for your question. We're at time. Thank you. If we didn't get to your question or you want to come up and chat, I think we'll all be hanging out for a few minutes. So have a great rest of the conference.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you, everybody.